design is aspirational. Certainly design education is aspirational. In order to succeed at your aspired goal, you have to fail a bit or a lot.
I'm excited to have Steve Heller today on the science of creativity. He's published over 200 books on graphic design, illustration, and political art. He's an artist, designer, and educator in New York City. He was an art director at the New York Times for over 30 years. He's written for the New York Times Book Review and many magazines. At the School of Visual Arts, he's a co-founder or a co-chair of several graduate MFA degree programs. You're really going to love this conversation about art, design, and creativity. I'm here with Steve Heller, a legendary design educator, and I'm just really happy to have him here on the show. Steve, welcome to the Science of Creativity.
Thanks, Keith. It's great to be here.
Well, you've done so many things. I've known about your work for a long time. I've looked at your CV to get ready for this. As a matter of fact, right now I have my hand on a stack of your books. So you've done so many things. I wanted to ask for our listeners, how would you describe yourself? What is your primary personal or professional identity?
Well, that's kind of tough because I have done a number of things that are all related to the arts. So I would say I'm art adjacent. That's how I describe myself. I flitter around the edges of different art forms. I write about designers and illustrators and political cartoonists and people who are somehow within that structure. And I write about popular culture and things that affect our culture. So I've done a book on the Red Scare, which is akin to something we're beginning to go through now again. I've written about the swastika, only to learn that I've misjudged the swastika for all these years. So what I would say I am is constant learner, somebody who puts his foot where his mouth is and learns from that mistake.
Yeah, I'm intrigued that you said you were art adjacent because, your books have design on them and you're a graphic design educator, but you also say that you're art adjacent. Is that because you think of design as an art or is similar to the arts?
It is an art. It just happens to be an applied art. But more and more, there are designers who are doing design as their art, and artists traditionally known as fine artists who are doing design as their art, using type and image in very similar ways, except for a very different audience, or maybe not so different audience. The audiences are converging. And this is not anything new. I mean, this goes back to the beginnings of modern art, when letter forms and newspapers and magazines were part of the artist's vocabulary.
I understand. And in my own research as a psychologist, and I've looked at artists and designers, and what I see is a lot of similarity, at least in the way people think and the way people see. And I know you've said that before as well, that there's not really a lot of difference between the arts and design today. So could you say a little bit about what do they share in terms of how the designer or the artist is working? What do art and design share in terms of the way you're thinking or seeing as you're going about doing it?
Well, first thing I'd say very generally is what they share is they're working. Art is work. And I think it was Milton Glaser who said that. There are different kinds of art forms that require different kinds of work, different kinds of knowledge, different kinds of inspiration. But essentially, it's to keep the juices flowing, to make sure that your mind doesn't become encrusted and a fossil within a living body. So I think the similarities are that need to be creative or at least functioning as a human being.
You said something intriguing. You said you don't want to become a fossil in a living body. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, there are lots of folks who let their brains atrophy. They run routines. They follow set patterns. It doesn't mean they're inferior people, but it does mean that they're missing out on challenges that life offers. And I just kind of provocatively say they're fossilized brains. They could have very active brains in areas that I just don't have any interest in. So you might say what I said about fossilization is an elitist comment, but it is the first comment that came to my mind.
And it's not at all fulfilling if you have this approach to your work, right?
No, fulfillment is different for different people. For some, just waking up in the morning is fulfillment. For others, knowing every baseball card that's ever been produced for the Yankees is fulfillment. I wouldn't call it an art, but I'd call it a savant skill.
As an educator, is there some way that you can help teach students how to be that way? Can you teach them how to avoid being a fossilized artist or designer?
It's assumed that anybody who comes into art school is on a track to aspire to something. And that something is going to be within the arts, visualization, written, performative, video, drawing, whatever. So the audience that I'm dealing with is already primed to be active. They may not be primed to know how to create ideas or exploit their talents or skills in a creative manner, but they're already on the trajectory or they wouldn't have come into an art program. Once they're in, then there are dozens of ways of keeping them inspired and making them reach a certain potential. Presumably, they all have potential or they wouldn't have been enrolled in their various art programs.
To me, it seems incredibly difficult that you could teach someone how to think in this way or how to be an artist or a designer or how to be a better one. Like you say, they come in, they're already very good. So, yeah, to me, as an outsider, I don't teach art or design. It just seems like it requires incredible skill. I mean, would you agree with that? Do you think it's hard to teach this ability?
Well, it's hard to teach certain specific tasks because the technology has altered the way we learn and the way we teach. But generally speaking, I think if someone at the front of that classroom has experienced the creative process, it's not that difficult to inspire the people sitting in the chairs. It's perhaps a little more difficult to get them to work with the tools that are available. But, you know, go back to the Renaissance. The apprentices to the great painters had to learn techniques that basically recreated the world on a canvas or on a wall, fresco, or sculpt. And those are things that I can't even imagine doing because it means there has to be an innate ability to do so. But I think being able to inspire somebody is easy if you have the inspiration yourself. And art is more than inspiration, it's also knowledge. If you have the knowledge and the inspiration, it's just a matter of conveying it and making sure that the people who receive it are receiving it, understanding it, literate. So I think it starts by teaching literacy, and then it goes into these other areas that are definable, but once you define them, they become rules and tenets. And somebody trying to teach the creative business has to be very careful not to fill the receiver up with hard and fast rules and regulations.
To me, that is still seeming incredibly challenging. I thought the hardest thing to do would be to inspire students. I'm a college professor, and I don't know if I can say I've ever done that. Maybe I have. My student course evaluations, they never say he was an inspiring teacher. So that to me just sounds so difficult. And then the second thing you said was teaching them the skills. And that I can understand. If you're going to be a painter, you know, need to know how to paint. In your case, you're teaching illustrators. So you need to teach them that illustration. And would you say that you yourself have that passion that allows you to communicate that to students?
I'd say it comes and it goes. It depends on a lot of factors that are external and internal, emotional forces, political forces. Fashion has something to do with how I think. My course evaluations are usually, I was interested in what he had to say. I
Right.
got something out of it. But when I talk to students, the best comment, the best kudo that I could get is that something that I said inspired them to do X, Y, or Z. And
Right,
so
right.
I may not be, quote unquote, an inspiring teacher, but I offer inspiration. I think of myself not as a teacher in any event. I think of myself as a lecturer.
Ah, okay.
And as a lecturer, it really depends on how I present the information and how I decide what information to present.
That's interesting that you say that because the books that I'm looking at, like I said, I have my hand on a stack. Design School Confidential, for example, which you co-authored or co-edited with Lita Tallarico. It's a collection of studio projects, but now you're saying you don't teach in that way. Is that right? That you don't teach using studio projects?
No, I sometimes do studio projects, but essentially my classes are supposed to be seminars. I've changed that over the years because I was getting bored with the seminars. So I can imagine the students weren't getting much either. Also, the demographic of students have changed. And since I've taught the history of political and cultural satire and dissent and commentary, many of my references have been lost over time. And I could mention somebody like Richard Nixon, and the class of students would look at me blankly. So I have to figure out some way of making the historical references contemporary. And I do that by giving them assignments and letting them take over the class for a week at a time, so that every other week they get me and every other week they get themselves. In one class in particular, which I've been doing now for a few years, it's on propaganda. And because of this political situation that we're in now, it's half about the history of propaganda and half about branding democracy. When I give the history of propaganda class, I usually show them what propaganda is, talk to them about it as a religious origin and how it's used both in so-called positive ways and definite negative ways. And then I ask them to come up with their own propaganda campaigns, try to convince me and everyone else that something that they're interested in should be interested in by others or supported by others or backed by others. or enraged by others. And so they get to do it, and it's not a matter of just sitting around and listening to me rattle off dates and names.
That sounds like it could be a communication design class, right? If you're giving them an assignment, they could develop campaign posters, or they could, I don't know, write speeches of a fascist leader. But are you teaching them to use their graphic design skills, or is this, like you say, a seminar class?
They have to use their graphic design skills to make their messages come together. And they're free to do whatever they want. They can do it in whatever medium they choose that they feel is going to make the most impact. It's a communications design class in the broadest sense. It's a manipulation class in the narrowest sense. You, as a student, are being asked to manipulate the rest of us, either in a positive way or a negative way, either for or against something. And how you do that is really a matter of trying to avoid the cliches that come with this, the tropes that are attendant in propaganda campaigns. So in some cases, it's comes down to an aesthetic problem, and in some cases comes down to a conceptual verbal picture problem. Whatever it is, I'm interested in the manner in which they solve the problem, meaning the look and feel of it. But I'm also just as, if not more, interested in the thing that they've chosen to do and why they've chosen to do this thing. We have lots of students who come from countries that are not democratic, for example, or have awkward democracies, which is what ours is. How do they grapple with that? How do they grapple with the idea that maybe their propaganda at home has downgraded democracy in favor of something else? In philosophical thought, Socrates is said to have been the pusher of democracy, whereas Plato in his Republic was really guiding a way towards authoritarianism. And the students have to deal with those kind of philosophical issues as well.
It sounds like a really interdisciplinary course where they're using their design skills, their visual skills, but they maybe it touches on psychology, and now you've talked about politics. Is that right? Would you call it an interdisciplinary course?
Yeah, and it's all psychology. I mean, aesthetics is psychology. When I took psychology one, I was surprised that we were spent a whole semester on color.
Oh, that's interesting.
I didn't know that that's what it was. I thought it was you go into a psychology class and they put you on a couch and talk to you for a baker's hour. But the idea that color came into the equation was very foreign to me. But we talk about color now as being one of the foundational blocks in developing identities, which is part of an offshoot of propaganda. What certain colors evoke in the receiver is key to how propaganda campaigns, both political and commercial, operate.
Well, you're an instructor at the School of Visual Arts in New York City, and I assume these students are coming there to get BFAs or MFAs in graphic design. So is this something that they're not expecting? They say, I thought you were going to teach us how to do graphic design, and now you're teaching us about politics. Or I guess I would assume that you think this is going to help them be better designers, right?
Well, I'm definitely sure it's going to help them be better designers, but the program that I co-founded and co-chaired, and now I'm co-chair emeritus of, was subtitled Designer as Entrepreneur. And in order to be an entrepreneur, you have to be able to think independently and use your design skills to bolster or frame your entrepreneurial idea. therefore, a class like this in propaganda is necessary in terms of how you market and sell your idea, whatever that idea may be, a nonprofit environmental idea or a for-profit commercial idea. One of our students who's very successful right now, Julia Marsh, her concept from the very beginning would create something that would argue against and actively advocate against the use of plastics. Now, you may think that that's a very difficult problem because the world is full of these poisonous plastics, but she decided she would create plastic substitute from seaweed. And that became her thesis project and it became her goal in life and now is her business, which is personed by at least a dozen, if not more, designers and others. And she's gotten a few $1 million in grant support.
You're listening to The Science of Creativity, a podcast about art, design, and invention. If you're enjoying the episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast and rate the show and leave a comment because it helps people like you find the show. You can find The Science of Creativity on all podcast platforms. That's an impressive success. And you're talking about a graduate program, right? A Master of Fine Arts degree.
MFA, yeah.
Right. So these students, they come in, they have some experience, right? They have some background, and then they're hoping that this MFA degree will teach them how to combine these design skills. Do they come in with experience as designers, or do they come in as successful or aspiring entrepreneurs?
Both.
Right. A couple of years ago, when I talked to you and you were talking about what you do in the classroom, you said that one thing you're trying to teach the students is how to think or ways of thinking. And to me, that fits in with interdisciplinarity because, ways of, if you're thinking in a particular way, you could be thinking that way in a variety of disciplines. So how would you describe that? How are you teaching them how to think?
Well, first of all, I don't think that I'm teaching them how to think. I'm teaching them that they can think and that they can fail at what they're thinking about, that the iterative process is a lengthy one. And let's just take Julia Marsh for an example. She wanted to do something about plastics. So at some point in her 2 years here, she did a campaign that addressed the plastic crisis in the world and realized that that campaign was going to go nowhere, that it was what we used to call tree hugging. And you could be as much of an environmentalist as you like, but unless you can do something tangible, a poster or a brochure isn't going to make much of a difference. So she evolved through iteration a concrete product that would not only illustrate what she has in mind, but may actually create something that would alleviate to some extent, to at least a little extent, the problem that exists today.
There are two things you said that resonated with me, and one was failure and the other was iteration. And the reason it stood out is because I was looking at your book, Design School Confidential, which is a collection of over 50 class projects and class assignments from design schools around the world. And then you wrote the introduction where you're talking about the shared characteristics of a really good assignment. And one of the things you mentioned there was the importance of failure, or the students having that experience of failure in the class.
Yeah, it's important to fail because invariably the people who get the best critiques are those who have made the most mistakes. If you're doing something perfectly out of the gate, you're going to get somebody saying, wow, that's great. And where do you take that? You take it to your bed at night and say, oh, I got a gold star, but it's not going to help you build upon your work. What you want is some way of expanding what you've done. As I said, I think design is aspirational. Certainly, design education is aspirational. Therefore, in order to succeed at your aspired goal, you have to fail a bit or a lot to do so. And we've seen this in business, we've seen it in government, we've seen it very often where competency and success don't necessarily go hand in hand. And those two things should be distinguished. By failure, I don't mean incompetency. I mean experimental mistakes.
You said the critiques where students have failed are the ones that are, I think you said, the best critiques. But speaking from the student perspective, honestly, that sounds like the worst critique. The student's going to be miserable at the end of that critique. Or are they going to realize, even though I'm miserable, I realized that that was a great learning experience? How do you help them realize that this has been a beneficial experience?
You tell them.
You just tell them, right?
You give them license to fail. You don't come in and say, this is the stupidest thing I've ever seen. You go in and you say, I see what you're doing, and this is how you might try it to make it more successful, that it's not working. I think we've infantilized our students too much these days. Students are not as fragile as psychologists seem to think. Sure, there are many that have developmental and cognitive problems, and we need to be aware of those. But if you get through the screening process to get into a program that has limited enrollment, the odds are that the vast majority, not the entire group, is going to be able to address any kind of critique, and that's what they come for. They come because otherwise they can do things in their garage and get somebody's opinion. But what they want is an experiential opinion. They want some wisdom as well as some solid practical knowledge. So I worry about a student not understanding, but if I see that happening, I'll talk to that student separately and say, look, you haven't committed a sin. You don't have to do 4 Hail Marys. What you have to do is the job over again and see where it takes you.
In my case, if I were going to SVA to take a class from the famous Steve Heller, frankly, I would be there to get your opinion. I want to know what you think because of your wisdom and your experience.
Yeah, well, I would say that my wisdom and experience is based on a reaction to what I'm seeing in front of me. I have certain tropes that I use with students. Everybody does. But the way I'm going to respond to a student's work is by what I see and what I know about that student. So what I tell you might be different from what I tell somebody else doing the exact same thing. And I also preface most of what I say, but by this is opinion. There are definite ways of doing certain things, but there are multiple ways of approaching other things. And this, I try to distinguish one from the other so that if it's about a piece of type that was set, they should go to the best book in town by Robert Bringhurst, let's say, and look at that book, and that'll tell you how best to kern your typeface. I'm not going to tell them that. What I will tell them is there's something amiss going on here, and you need to work on that. And I'll pass them on to the typography teacher.
I've noticed that the best instructors that I've talked to, like yourself, you have this ability to see what the students have done. And I don't know, this special language or the special ability to spot things in a student's work. So when you're talking about it, it's something that the students don't yet see themselves. Is that right?
Well, presumably not. But, there's such a thing as being lazy. And I've been lazy enough in my career where fortunately I've had an editor that says go further and doesn't do it for me, but involves me in the process of going further. And I can tell when somebody's kind of phoned it in, and I can also tell now when somebody's AI'd it,
Right.
which is, a lot of educators are worried about the AI fixation and what that's going to mean to the origin of ideas, the effects of AI on creativity, whereas others are saying it's another tool to master. And I believe both things are true. Before AI, there was just copying. Some people did very well as copyists. They never aspired to be original. And being original is damn hard anyway.
I noticed a connection that I hadn't thought of before, where you said, as a writer yourself, you work with an editor and you've been an art director at the New York Times for over 30 years. So you're getting feedback there. So it seems like as an instructor in a BFA or MFA program, you're almost acting as if you are an editor for what the students are doing.
Well, I'm definitely the art director. The art director is an editor. That's the way it was at the New York Times. We often had fights with word editors for various reasons, but we were both on the editorial plane. And I've been an editor enough on books and periodicals to know how to act as one. So I can be that to some of the students. On the other hand, I believe that students shouldn't be led by the nose. And often what I'll say, it used to be a joke that people would say about me. When somebody brought in a piece of work, I'd say, it'll do. And that either triggered them to do it again or just take it at face value. That'll do. I think the student has to come up with the solution rather than me find a solution. I can say this is not right, or this doesn't work, or this could be better. I can even say you might try such and such, but I'm not going to dictate unless we're up against a deadline and there's no other way of getting the answer in a timely manner.
These design class projects that you have in many of your books, one of the characteristics that they share is that they give students an open-ended problem, a challenge that gives them a lot of creative opportunity or a lot of flexibility. It sounds like that's what you're describing now, right? That you need to give students a challenge where they do have to find their own unique pathway toward a solution.
They have to, when they get their assignment, say to themselves, how the fuck am I going to do this? They have to question themselves immediately and get a little scared or nervous or anxious. And sometimes they're not going to find the answer. And that's okay. They'll suffer the consequences of that, whether it's a percentage of a grade or a sense of humiliation if they are fragile enough. But they have to be a little nervous about what they're going to do. It has to be a challenge.
Design school sounds really hard, or at least hard, maybe psychologically, that you have to be able to face yourself in these moments.
Well, I think design school, music school, dramatic arts, writing, all of these things, if you haven't done them before, require testing yourself and learning what's right and wrong. I would assume it's the same in psychology. Psychologists, as far as I know, are continually being analyzed, at least analytical clinical psychologists, because they have questions and they have issues themselves. And many psychologists that I know as friends got into the field because they had to deal with their own mishigas. So I think there's not a job in the world, unless you're sitting as a gatekeeper taking tickets at Yankee Stadium, that isn't challenging and isn't hard. And you look at what somebody has done and you say, how can you do that? How can you run a record business, a retail business? It must be very hard knowing how to keep stock and knowing how to balance the books and all of that. You know, society is based on a certain amount of stress, which is why clinical psychologists and psychiatrists exist. That stress has to be addressed in some way, shape, or form. I forget which direction this went in, but I had read that in the Third Reich, psychiatrists were not considered welcome in the country, but psychologists were. That the psychiatrists came to psychiatry with certain rules, many of them counter to what the state wanted, whereas psychologists were not as rule burdened and allowed the patient to find their own answers.
It's interesting that this came up because in my notes to prepare for the interview, I actually wrote down a quotation that really stood out to me. It's in your 2009 book, Design School Confidential. And it's a mouthful, but I want to read it because it's so compelling. You say the most successful projects are intensive challenges that force students to go beyond perfunctory solutions to find a catharsis that offers greater knowledge, understanding, and perhaps even wisdom. Wow.
Well, you know, you ask a lot, you get a lot. If you ask too much, you get a stressed out student. And maybe that is an indication to the student and teacher that the field they're trying to enter is not the right field. Maybe there's something else that would make their lives a little less unhappy. Because the one thing that comes out of all of this, including the consequence of that long quote, is that you've got to enjoy what you're doing. There are too many people who work for the sake of feeding their families and surviving. And that's a very admirable vocation and need. But if you can enjoy what you're doing, that's a real asset. Einstein, I'm sure, enjoyed coming up with the theory of relativity.
It's something I tell my son who's in college right now is that if you can find a job that actually will allow you to support yourself financially and you also really enjoy your job, then you are one of the luckiest people in the world.
Yeah, it's considering how many people are in the world who are in extreme poverty or in state run jobs that demand certain functional outcomes. It is somebody who's lucky. I mean, a lot of my own research into propaganda deals with totalitarian regimes, and I wrote a book called Iron Fists: Branding the Totalitarian State. And one of the things I found interesting in terms of Nazi Germany was they set up a program called joy and work that instituted as an official decree that everybody who worked should have some enjoyment out of it. So they had, in a sense, forced vacations where they were given opportunities to travel within a prescribed area, to go camping, to do things that were family oriented. I mean, this was all controlled, but when you're in the middle of it, it doesn't seem like control. It seems like benevolence.
Oh, that was a powerful comment. When you're in the middle of it, it doesn't seem like control. It seems like benevolence. Well, let's hope we can all learn to see that. And it's amazing that you're able to do that with your students. I like to end the interviews by asking for our listeners if you could give us some sort of piece of advice or some practical exercise, something you could do in the next week that might enhance your creativity in some way.
You had asked me that question at the outset, and I don't have an answer that totally satisfies me. But what I would say that has some virtue, but it doesn't have any wisdom, is to look at other people's work, to look at those things that you would aspire to do that brings you joy or brings you satisfaction or brings you catharsis, to engage in that and not just sit home and watch cable shows and as a binge opportunity, which I have to say I do. But if you're going to binge, get something out of the binge. Look at the way the actors act. Contemplate how something's been written and staged or filmed. There's so many things you can do just walking down the street that can trigger ideas and lead to curious behavior that equals a creative impulse.
It sounds like I would call that mindfulness and awareness in your everyday life.
It is being aware of who you are and what interests you and what you would like to be interested in. And sometimes there are things that you think you're excited about, and in fact, you just are excited as a voyeur and not as an active participant. My suggestion is to find something that you can actively take part in, either on your own or in a collaboration.
Well, Steve, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Well, thank you. I have as well.
I have to admit, I haven't read all 200 of Steve's books, but to prepare for this interview, I read more than a handful, and they really are fascinating. If you're going to teach in a BFA or an MFA program, I highly recommend that you start by reading some of Steve's books. They're filled with project assignments and practical classroom advice. But really, Steve's wisdom goes beyond the practical details of teaching a class. I think he knows how to teach students how to see and how to think in new and profound ways. Thank you for listening to The Science of Creativity. If you liked this episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast, and please rate the show because that helps others like you hear about the show. Please write in the comments if you have requests or ideas for future episodes. I'll see you next time on The Science of Creativity for insights and inspiration about art, design, and invention.